and welcome back to the Cherry on Top YouTube channel. I'm Jessica, and today's video is for our Technique Tuesday video series, where each month we have a new topic that we focus on, and this month we are using our favorite mixed media products. Last week I made a video using acrylic paints, which I'll still be using a bit today. But for this video, I'm more focused on waxes. If you haven't used waxes, I highly recommend it. Anytime I'm using anything that has dimension, I like to go over it with some wax because it's so easy and it adds such a beautiful effect. I'm starting this project by creating some molded pieces using a mold that has these pretty photo corners that I'm going to layer up and stick on my frame. So to do this, I'm using some modeling material, but you could also use hot glue, just squeeze it right out of your hot glue gun, or also resin. I chose to use the modeling material because it's pretty quick and easy. It takes maybe 2 or 3 hours to dry, but you can speed that along a little bit using a heat tool. So I got all of those pieces made, and now I'm working on layering around my corners. I used some chipboard pieces and then layered on my modeling material corners, and I also have some metal pieces from Tim Holtz that I thought would layer in nicely and go with my organic look that I'm trying to achieve. I'm now gluing these pieces down using Nouveau Deluxe adhesive. There are a lot of different adhesives you could use for this. You could use any type that says it's good for mixed media, but really you just want some glue that is going to have a strong hold and not move these pieces around. But also when I start layering paint on top, that will also help hold all of these pieces in place. The metal pieces are the pieces that take a little bit longer to adhere, and that's because I applied the glue a bit thicker because they're not flat on one side. So I just had to be a little more patient to wait for them to dry. And again, you could use a heat tool to speed along this process. Now I'm grabbing some black gesso and I'm going to paint over all of my corners, and I'm doing this with a smaller, more detailed brush, and that's so I can get into all of these small crevices of these flower forms. If I have a hard time reaching deeper into some of the crevices, I water down my gesso a little bit so I can make sure to get in there. And now I'm using a larger brush to paint the rest of the frame. I didn't want to paint the whole frame using that small brush because it would take forever, and then I would also have a lot of uneven brush strokes that you would notice a lot more over the larger areas. I'm not only going to be adding paint and waxes to the top, I'm also going to do it on the sides as well. For this project, I'm using a Doodlebug shadow box, but you could also use any old frame that you have that just needs a little more excitement to it, or just test it out on a mirror or whatever else you might have. So once I have all of the black gesso dried, I'm going to go in with an off-white color and use a dauber to apply it. And you can see here how it really starts to bring out all of those elements because it doesn't reach into the deep crevices, so they stay that nice black color, and where it's lighter is the most raised surfaces. So I just really like how this is starting to come out. And you don't have to do this with a white, but I thought it would be cool because then I can use the waxes to really layer on whatever colors. So once I start working with the waxes, I'm going for more of a rose gold colored frame, but there are so many different wax colors where you could make a blue frame or purple or green or whatever else that you're trying to do, which I think is pretty cool. So I wanted to show that technique with the black and then moving to a lighter color so you can see your waxes on top. And I'm making sure to paint the sides as well because I don't want it to just be like a plain sides that don't match the rest of the frame. So don't forget about these areas. And I really think you should use a dauber for this portion. I don't think it would turn out so well if I was using a paintbrush, just because paintbrushes can reach into those crevices a little bit better, and I really wanted to keep those areas dark. I'm also making sure to paint over and distress some of the longer areas on this frame. Now I'm going to use some Stamperia beeswax and mix it with the Stardust powder to create one of the types of waxes that I'm using. These waxes are super cool and all of them smell really great. So the Stamperia one, you get a jar of beeswax and then you mix in the pigments, and then I'll also be using some Prima waxes that you don't have to mix together, but I thought I would show a couple different ways on how to do it. Now I'm using a stencil brush, so this is like a firm bristle brush, to reach into some of those areas a little bit more where I wanted it to get a little bit lighter. And now I am using both a vintage patina from Stamperia as well as a rich copper metallic wax from Prima. I'm starting with the rust color, which is more of a matte type of wax, and this is like in between an acrylic paint and a wax. So it's a little bit thinner and you can apply it more how you would a regular paint. You can also water it down a little bit more. So I am going over all of the areas where I had the white to start changing that color to more of a rusty color. And like I said, you could do this with any mix of colors. I recommend grabbing at least a couple different colors that you're working with. So if you wanted to make this a blue frame, grab a wax in a dark blue and then a lighter blue, and start with your darker blue and do the lighter blue on top, and this will really give you a lot of definition. So I'm using the stencil brush again to apply this because I want this in more areas than just the highest raised areas, because that's what I'm going to use with the other wax. So it's just I wanted this to be in a broader area than where I'm going to put this Prima wax, which I'm just going to apply with my finger. And I'm doing this because I have a lot more control with it, and I can just apply it to the highest raised surfaces. I'm also going to use a pearl white wax as well to add a little bit more lightness. So again, as I work up in layers, I'm just using less and less each layer that I do so that you can still see all of the layers behind it. And in mixed media, I feel like the more layers that you do, the more interesting a piece gets. So you can really layer and go back and forth and add more of a color if you want, and that's what I think is really fun about this. Working with the waxes though, I will say once you start with the waxes, you don't want to move back to acrylic paint because the paint is not going to stick on the waxes very well. So once you start with the wax, just keep layering with different color waxes instead of going back to using paints. But the waxes do stick wonderfully on top of paints, so just be conscious of what you're layering on top of what. The waxes also stick nicely on top of each other. And once they're dry, they are permanent, So this is a frame that I could clean and dust using warm water, and it will be just fine. Now I'm going to mat my photo in here. I debated on if I wanted to do more like a scrapbook layout in the inside of this frame, but I decided to just have a nice clean matted photo so that it was not too distracting with all that was happening with the frame. So I'm starting by adding some foam to the back of the photo, and then I first matted it on some black cardstock, and then I'm going to use wet glue to stick it onto some watercolor paper. I picked the watercolor paper because it has a nice off-white color, like it's not a stark white, and then also it has a little bit of texture, which I thought would look nice. A lot of times I don't really bother too much with making sure my page is perfectly square, but this is a project that I wanted to make sure that it was perfectly square, so I used the wet glue so I could move it around if needed, and then I used a T-square to make sure that everything was nice and even and square. And that is it for this project. I hope this has given you some inspiration to give waxes a try.